Today on Data Nation, we dive into the world of immigration, legal and illegal, what's happening in our country right now, how controlling immigration has been successful and not so successful in the past, how we can control the chaos that seems to fill our southern border, and the potential future of immigration policy. I'm Liberty Vittert, professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and my co-host is Minzer Dale, William A. Coolidge Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Joining us for this fascinating discussion are Giovanni Peri, a distinguished professor in international economics at the University of California, Davis, and Margaret Peters, professor of political science and the chair of the Global Studies Interdisciplinary Program at UCLA. Let's get right to our questions. Giovanni, I think I have to start with you with this question. And, according to a Pew Research Center poll, the number of immigrants living in the United States increased by roughly, I think it was 1.6 million people in 2023, the largest annual increase since, I think, 2000. So how would you say that this growth in immigration has shaped U.S. labor markets in the country's economy? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Do we have data that backs up one of these points?
I think that before answering exactly, I need to put in perspective this 1.6 million figure that you gave. So the U.S. immigration, the net change in foreign born in the U.S. between 2000 and 2019 was about 1.2, 1.3 million per year. So the normal flow of immigrants between 2000 and 2019 was around 1.2, 1.3 millions per year growth. In 2020 and 2021, we had the two lowest year of immigration since the 1960s, in fact, with around 500,000 people, because COVID blocked all the borders, the embassies did not operate, and so we had a very low number. Then in 22 and 23, we rebounded to maybe a little bit above 1.5 millions, as you have cited. But if you look at the immigration, for instance, post-COVID, 2020 to 2023, on average, there was not a particularly high period of immigration compared to the 2000s. And if you go back in the 1990s, we had more than 1.7 million per year inflow. So number one, there was a rebound that got a lot of attention. I would say especially because the border situation was a little chaotic. And so this inflow of immigrants, which was not in absolute term very large, attracted a lot of attention. The second thing that I want to emphasize, to put this number in perspective again, is that the flow of immigrants since 2000, including the immigrant post-COVID, at least half of this inflow are people who are college educated and are professionals. So this is not a mass of people who don't have a degree and they are just manual worker. Immigration in the last 25 years in the US has been a very balanced or even a little bit skewed towards highly skilled and college educated. So you asked me how these affect the US economy and the US labor markets. Well, two main things I want to say to begin with. First, this balanced inflow of college and non-college educated immigrants, which has been regular in the last decades, has been a very important engine of growth of employment and of the economy of the United States. These people are not only workers, they are investors, they are entrepreneurs, they are consumers. They increase demand, they increase the size of the economy. And as a consequence, this constant flow of people, worker, investor, consumers, has been quite beneficial to the US economy and to the US labor markets. The second thing I want to say right up front is that after 2020, the US population and labor market are in an unprecedented situation because the US population in working age has started shrinking. After having grown for the previous 3 decades, now we are at a stage in which the demographic transition in the US is such that from 2020 on, every year, the population in working age decreases by about 400,000 or 500,000. So in a situation like this inflow of people, it's particularly, I would say, economically meaningful because it replaces a lot of US workers.
And I just want to be clear, when you are quoting these numbers, are these legal immigrants?
These are total immigrants. These are immigrants estimated from the census data that allow us to count every person in the United States. And so this is an aggregate of legal and illegal. Let me say a couple of things about the legal and illegal estimate. So the estimate of illegal immigrants into the United States reaches a peak on the number of illegal immigrants around 11.5 million in 2005. Between 2005 and 2022, there has been actually no net change almost, if anything, a little negative, a little decrease of undocumented immigrants. This is Pew Hispanic Center source. This is Homeland Security data source. In 2022 and 2023, the big flow that came in through the border technically is not undocumented illegal. Most of the people crossed under one of these three categories: asylum seeker, humanitarian parole, and temporary protected status, which are legal, but they are temporary visas. So I think here the confusion has been these people are technically still legal, but if the new administration revokes those type of visa, they could become undocumented, so not legal. But the flow of immigrants in the last 15, 20 years has been mostly in net legal immigrants coming into the United States. The big number of undocumented, which is still here, 11 million, are people who mostly arrived in the US in the 90s and in the early 2000s. So yes, we have an issue of undocumented living in the US, working in the US, many of them for 10, 20 years, but we didn't have an issue of large inflow of them. And in the last 2 years, we had this rebound of humanitarian immigrants who could become undocumented if the rule change.
So maybe I can follow up with you, Maggie, on some of the things. The first point that Giovanni made, which is the labor benefits that has happened with immigrants, and then contrast that a little bit to the current president offering this gold card for $5 million for immigrants, not only in terms of the impact of this kind of immigration, but also the message that it's sending in terms of who are the people that can have value in this country versus the others that don't have value. Maybe you can comment on this particular sort of political landscape there.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point to think about splitting up these flows depending on how we think about them. So, as Giovanni mentioned, we now have declining numbers of people entering the labor force. And we need people in basically every labor category. So I'm here in California, in Los Angeles. As you know, we had these giant fires just a couple months ago. We have to, I forget the total number, something like 40,000 plus structures burned. That's a lot of construction workers. We don't have that many construction workers here in the United States. So it's great to bring in investors who want to start businesses, who want to be entrepreneurs here, who want to invest in our companies, but they also need workers. We need workers in all different categories. And especially if we're going to have this idea that we want to bring manufacturing back to the United States, we are going to need people to do that. And so when we think about that, we need people at all levels, not just very wealthy people, not just international students and PhD students and very smart, highly educated people, but people who are at all levels to do everything from, again, I'm a Californian, so I'm thinking about who's picking the food on the farms, who's doing construction, who's working in the service industry. And as we've seen, especially post COVID, we constantly see people complaining about like they can't find anybody to work anymore. And so, what we really need in the economy is workers.
So let me kind of understand the messaging that comes with these types of things, right? So how can this be messaged so that the public recognizes that this is what we need? The president's message sends a different kind of signal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is always very hard to message around this for two reasons. One is we're talking about bringing in other people and people who might not look like us, might not speak the same language, might not have the same religion. And so that can be sort of nerve wracking about thinking about how these folks are going to change our society in other ways. So, really, what this is focused on, not so much about the labor market, although that's often used as this cudgel that, like, oh, it's the immigrants who are pushing down wages, which Giovanni's work clearly shows that this is very rarely the case, if ever. But it's really about fear of changing culture. And this is something that we've seen, I mean, again and again and again and again throughout history. I mean, you go back, Benjamin Franklin is railing in the like 1760s about these Germans who just don't understand America. And now you're like, that seems ridiculous. And then you see no Irish need apply in the 1840s. Later on, you see Southern and Eastern Europeans, and it just continues on and on again. And every time we have this group and we say, like, well, they're not integrating, they always integrate into American society. That is one of America's superpowers. We integrate immigrants into our society like no other country does. And we don't even have like special government programs to do this. The Europeans give all these special government programs to try and get people to integrate. And there's some sort of special sauce here in America that allows migrants to integrate very well into our society. A combination of our labor market, a combination of like sort of our immigrant culture, and a combination of all sorts of different factors in America that allow immigrants to integrate really well.
Can I add one little thing? I agree with what Maggie says 100%. I think a lot about how can we message things in a way that it's effective. And I think I would suggest two things that we can say. One is this idea that this distinction between documented and undocumented, legal and illegal immigration. So one way to say this is that the US economy will need a lot of legal immigrants to fill a lot of the jobs that Maggie is mentioning, because we do need construction worker, agricultural worker. We also need a lot of workers in healthcare that assist the elderly, that assist the disabled. We also need a lot of people in the hospitality sector, cleaning hotel, in the food sector, in the restaurants. These are all jobs that the US is demanding right now. There are massive shortages measured by the number of job openings that are there, which are not filled. A legal system that allows immigrants to come in to do this job will solve the problem. We don't have this right now. There is no way for a worker who does not have a college degree and for which there is a job that he or she wants to do and no American wants to do, there is not a legal way to come in. So the luck is on the legal side. We need to change the legal side. And the other messaging thing is this massive demographic change that US and all the Western world is going on. Even if you thought 20 years ago, then maybe our country had a lot of workers and it was crowded, that there could have been a possibility of displacement. Going forward, we're going to become elderly and nobody's going to take care of us as elderly people if we don't allow this. Immigrants don't take our jobs. They take care of our older people. So we need to think, I think, to push these two parts, I think, for a message, a positive message towards immigration.
But this kind of messaging, Giovanni, is also about policy change, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the center stage of immigration should become a discussion on policy change, on legal policy change, even to take away immigration for this very whimsical way of president doing executive order one way and then another president changing completely the executive order. I know the government is stuck. I know the House and the Senate are stuck, but until we propose something which has some consensus and is in the middle and makes sense, I think we're going to be always having these fluctuations.
With the goal of coming to some consensus. And I actually have to say, Maggie, I thought that was really interesting what you said about how America has done a really great job of integrating people. I lived in the UK for 9 years and there was no integration. There was one area where everybody was an immigrant lived, nobody bothered to learn English. They did a terrible job of integrating people and it was bad for both sides. So I think that's really interesting how you say America has done a great job. And with that idea of America doing such a great job and wanting to build consensus, Giovanni, you talked about how this immigration has been really great for the economy. And, we see talking points from some people that are like immigration drives down jobs and wages. What data do we have that truly supports this concept that immigration is good for our economy? Do we have some numbers around this concept?
We have a lot of data. We have a lot of research that takes data from US Census and American Community Survey, which are the most complete picture that we have every year of our country, and count and look at how many immigrants are in there, some of the number we cited before from here. And then we try to develop clever and effective way to isolate the impact of immigrant on local economies. So we have a lot of papers, some of which I have written, that show that in period of large inflow of immigrant, the local economy grow faster, local economy become bigger, the wage of Americans don't decrease, and even the difference between high and low skill wage doesn't change very much. And this is because we see that immigrants do type of job which are different from what the Americans do, because immigrants create companies on top of taking job, because immigrants demand goods and therefore increase the demand for other type of work. So I would say that the analysis of the effect of immigration in the US, both at the macro country aggregate or looking at local labor market, suggests, and over again, I think the consensus is that the effect on the economy are mostly positive. Of course, if you focus in period of only large inflow of only people who are relatively low educated, and you only look at the wage of Americans who were exactly in the same sectors, then you find some competition and so, some potential negative effect on their wage. But these are normally more than offset by this aggregate positive effect on local demand, on local firms. One thing that I want to say also to connect what Maggie and you said before in terms of the US has done a great job in integrating immigrants. I think one of the reasons has been that immigrants in the US come to work. The US employment rate of immigrants is higher than the employment rate of similar Americans. This does not happen anywhere in the world. First, and the second generation immigrants have been incredibly successful in the US. Not only they converge to income which are normally higher than the other immigrants, they come in a variety of skills, they bring ideas, they have been an incredible contribution to the US. So these are all strengths the US have in spite of its immigration system, I would say.
One thing I just want to add on Giovanni's point there, especially about the economic effects, is immigration doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So, on the one hand, if we have fewer workers, companies can make less stuff, which means that there is less stuff sold, which means that our stuff that we do sell is more expensive, which means we can't export it because it's not as competitive. And in an environment where companies, are still offshoring production, it means that companies move. People at the higher end lose their jobs because if let's say I've done a lot of studies here with like the agricultural farms and stuff here in California. If there aren't people picking strawberries in the fields, then there's nobody in the plastics industry to make the plastics containers. We lose trucking jobs because we're not shipping as many strawberries. We lose marketing jobs because we're not marketing the strawberries, and so on and so forth. And it becomes this sort of spiral by which communities sort of shrink. And we've seen this in the past, just not, with like outflows of immigrants from the United States, but think about all those areas that we call the Rust Belt areas now, where people started to leave, companies closed, they didn't have enough demand to stay open. So then people lost jobs, so they left, and it creates this sort of downward spiral. And then the other way companies might react if they can't hire immigrants is they turn to technology. And so you're not necessarily getting jobs back. You're just not having as many people working here, providing in taxes and things like that. So it's not just the choice isn't like for a company, I'm going to hire an immigrant or I'm going to hire a local host country citizen. It's much more of like, I'm going to hire an immigrant or I'm going to close my doors or I'm going to mechanize or I'm going to buy that part from overseas. And so if you want to grow a strong US economy, we need workers. So just it's not a total trade-off between citizens and immigrants. It's this whole big economy out there.
I have to say that in the last 3 years, I think the migration problem has got in large part mixed up with the chaos at the border. Americans hate this idea that immigration is in chaos, is out of control. Always when you hear immigration, the word is there is an immigration crisis. Nobody ever talk about there is an immigration potential. No, it's an immigration crisis. This idea that we need to shift the narrative, I think putting the border in a more ordered and organized situation is going to be a needed step. If you look at the polls of Americans, most of the Americans are actually relatively favorable to immigration. They see immigration economic effect as positive. And there was this spike in negativity in 23 with all this hammering. We lost control. So the idea that in reality, we need to talk about things are back in control. And second, the stories of immigrants, which are so much more powerful than the number, we also have to choose the right stories. There are a lot of other interesting stories of refugees who come in the US and create companies and they are super successful. And we do need to go dig into that because that's the typical story. That's the average story. And the one who come here and is a criminal, of course there are some, but they are really the exception. I think that will help a little bit.
I was down at the border maybe multiple times, especially during 2022 and 2023. And while I understand that the numbers might be small relative to the country, it was chaos. So I feel like I have to understand because, Giovanni, what you said, this idea of creating a legal path for people who are dishwashers or people who are landscapers, that really speaks, I think, to a large part of the country who feels that legal immigration is correct. And you've heard this from, especially actually very conservative talking points that I'm okay, quote, I'm okay with legal immigration, with people who do it, quote unquote, the right way. So this idea of creating a pipeline for people to do it the legal way for these manual labor jobs, what would that look like? How would that actually be created? Because I would assume that's a huge amount of people, hard to keep track of. How could we actually create something like that?
So I think we have a lot of blueprints for creating this. A type of visa that I like is the H-1B visa without a cap or with a much larger cap. And I think we could create a similar thing for people who don't have a college degree. So the principle is that there are some American companies that need some worker, and they identify some of these workers to be non-US born. And so then they apply for a visa for this person. This person has to go through checks and they have to post the job first at a reasonable salary. They have to make sure that there is not American who will apply for the job. And then they can go and get the foreigners. I would say that the H-1B visa, which are for college educated, the problem now is that they have a very strict cap. And so there are many companies that will want more of them. But if you set the cap in a way that respond to the needs of the US economy, so it's not even that hard to calculate how many workers every year the US economy can absorb, and you could allow companies to connect and allow this flow of people who do all this type of job that we said in construction, in personal services, in hospitality. This will be a way to restructure the US immigration system. I actually think that given the reason for most immigrants to come is work, that this expansion of working type of visa could also correspond to reducing a little bit some of the family visa that we allow. Not to immediate family, you need to allow spouse and minor children, but there is no good reason why a brother, a cousin, an uncle should be preferred to come in relative to a person who will do a job in the United States. And the H-1B visa has the nice feature also that you come in as a temporary as the beginning, but if your employer sponsors you and you are happy with your job, you can turn it into a green card and then into a citizenship. Again, a lot of the problem with the current system is that now some of these temporary visas are hard to transform into permanent because there are these other cap on how many green card every year you give, how many people can qualify. But a visa that gives this two-step to worker who come in. Not all workers want to come in forever. Some want to work and go back, and that should also be allowed. But a system that allows this, I think, could handle relatively big numbers every year because you have companies identifying who they need and who do that. One visa that works really well, I think, really, really well, To me, the best working is the student visa in the United States. The student visa has no cap. School decide who are the people who they want. They select them how? Because they think that they're going to be good students, smart students. They come in, they adapt to the United States while they are students, so that they learn the language, learn the habit. And once they are graduated, they would be perfect worker citizen. And even there, this is only a temporary visa. So thinking of bridging this into the possibility of having another visa is another area in which I think we could expand the legal system in a very effective way.
There was in the past a notion of getting a labor certification. So there was a labor certification that comes before an application of a visa. And I don't understand all the debate that has happened, but one of the continued argument against the Labor Department being involved is that the argument that immigrants lower the standards of salaries. So the ability to bring in these foreign nationals into the country, you can pay them less, and hence, you lower the salaries. And so then the Labor Department was not part of the debate. Is this something that is true? And what is your comment? And sorry, Maggie, you can go ahead and comment as well.
There is a labor certification need on the H-1B. You need to have proof that you're paying. So that some people say that company find a way of going around it, but I think the important thing is to give power to the worker who comes in through competition across firms. So, for instance, one very important thing for this H-1B visa will be the portability of visa across companies. You come in sponsored by one, but then you're not connected to this company forever. You can have another company who offers you better condition, better salary. Competition between employer will guarantee, in large part, in many cases, a more fair and a better outcome for the worker. So there definitely some issue to go around, but there are ways of designing this visa not to give to the company an excessive power of control of the worker.
Yeah, and just to echo that, so since Giovanni mentioned student visas, at the UC system, where we're both professors, we have a certain percentage of in-state students that we have to take, and then we can take international students above that. And why do we have that? Well, in part because the state pays for the university, but also because international students pay a heck of a lot more in tuition, so they know that as the schools, because the state of California has decided not to fund the UCs very well for a long time, we have an incentive to have more international students. And so the state puts a cap on that. And in the same way, you could do labor certification. A lot of companies complain that that's really time consuming and kind of hard to do. But the same token, you could say, well, I'm going to have industry specific caps on how many immigrants you have. And you see other countries sometimes do immigrant caps. So Singapore's used them in the past. Some of the Persian Gulf countries have used them, but haven't ever really enforced them, but have used them in the past. So you can think about having these other sort of creative ways if you don't like the birth certification. And just like Giovanni said, you have to allow people to move between industries, but you could also think about having geographically specific visas. So, in Canada, certain of the provinces can bring in people to come and work in that province. And so if you say, we really need people in upstate New York, and we worry that if we just let people into New York, they're all going to go to New York City right away. But we want them to at least stay and work here for a little bit. You could put conditions like that on. And then, with some of these jobs, just to think about, we had a more or less successful agricultural workers program with the Mexicans called the Bracero program that didn't have portability between employers, which was a big problem. But one of the good things it did do is it allowed people to engage in seasonal labor practices. And so they would come to the United States for a while, go back home, come to the United States. And so you could imagine there are plenty of industries like that. So agriculture, but also summer camps, summer travel studies, or we need more ski people in the winter at the ski resorts. You can think about these sort of seasonal industries where we might want to have much more short-term temporary migration where people go home. And yes, we should have a pathway that those, if they want to stay, can stay, but many of those people probably won't. Most immigrants in the world go back after about 5 years. And so if you have that easy pathway there, they say well, I want to go home for a while, but I want to have the ability to go back in the future. That's what we really have closed off, is any ability to go back again. And so if we had more flexibility in this system, that would be possible. Now, of course, we would like actually need a workforce who could process all this. And going to Liberty's earlier point about chaos at the border, a lot of the reason we had chaos at the border was like, we don't have enough asylum judges. We don't have enough people to process. And we spend all of our border budget on like walls and fancy equipment and agents, and not enough on like the actual processing side of things. And so we could make a system, and plenty of countries do. Singapore does it, Canada does it, New Zealand does it, Australia does it. This isn't a wildly hard problem to solve.
One question I have in mind, slightly different, that relates to data itself. Are you comfortable with the amount of data available on immigration, or are there different types of data that you would like to have that you think is difficult to get? How available is this data?
So I think that in the last years, data scientists, economists, demographers have become quite creative. So I think that we have a lot of pretty good data from Census Bureau of Labor Statistics on the aggregate and the longer run. Recently, these administrative data are becoming very popular that follow individual through administrative records, and so you can reconstruct more their life, their path. And people in immigration have started using data from, Facebook, people moving across and trying to track things. So I would say two things about the data. What is sometimes hard is to find data that track people across countries. So if you want to follow a person and see how much they benefit from migration, it's a bit harder. However, to see how many people come in a country and where they go, that I think it's we are a little bit better at that. There is always something more that can be done, but I actually find. As a researcher, you always want to come up with a new idea, but I think that the big gap is how little people know about any of these data of the very basic. If I have to identify a problem in immigration, is not first of all that we don't have good data on immigration. Yeah, we have a picture, is always imperfect, can be improved, but how little right outside the circle of people who study, people know about basic statistic. What's the percentage of foreign born? How many of them are employed? Where do they go? What type of education they have? People don't have. So it's hard to communicate because people lack the basic knowledge of some important basic facts. So if I had to invest is in data literacy and information a little bit of the public. And of course, as a researcher, I always love looking at new data and this very detailed individual data that can follow people, which have become available in some European countries. US is a little bit behind, will come available, I think. But we'll also need to do a better job to tell about what these data are and what the story do they indicate to other people.
Yeah, and I was just echo the other problem I think for people understanding the data is, so the Department of Homeland Security comes out with a yearbook every year that has like really great numbers, and it goes back, and like the US, we have some of the best data on immigration going back in time, because in 1819 Congress demanded that we count everybody who is arriving on a boat. And so, but what gets complicated is as we moved away from just, everybody who arrives on a boat, we're just assuming that they're staying here, to having more and more visa categories, is the the legal term of who's an immigrant versus who's a temporary worker versus this can be complicated. And so when we say like X number of people come in a year, they're coming in under all sorts of different visas and for all different sorts of reasons. And I think it can be sort of hard for the average person to be like, well, what's the real number? And this is even worse if you look at the European data going back in time, where they have all sorts of different categories, and you're like, well, what is your actual number? Like that can be hard to figure out. So that's one of it. I mean, from the flip side, I would say like I'm increasingly doing work on emigration and people leaving, and countries have not tracked people leaving very well. On the other hand, since a lot of those folks are leaving authoritarian countries that are kind of bad, maybe we don't want them tracking to some extent. Maybe we want to let these people escape from these bad situations without being tracked by their government. So, as a researcher, I would love better data on how many people leave countries every year and where they're leaving from. But as a, somebody who understands what those governments might do with that data, I'm like, I'm okay. Like, and even when we think about all this data we're collecting on everybody these days, there's some point where I'm like, maybe we don't need all the tracking data all the time. Maybe I want to be a little more anonymous in my life.
It's interesting that you say that. I was working on a project that was geo-targeting in refugee camps so people could report war crimes, specifically for Syrian refugees in Greece. And the problem was that the bad people were also tracking and using geo-targeting to track people and see where people were going. And it was a really interesting concept of how we can almost track people too well and have some unintended consequences. But I know we have to wrap up right here. We could talk about all this forever, but I just have to ask, sort of each of you what your key takeaway would be that, really, what do you recommend for the United States government to do to shape the future of U.S. immigration policy? And I think, Giovanni, we might already know yours, but let us hear it once more.
I think we need to do a much better job to explain what immigration is, what is meant for the United States, what the real numbers are, and if we could frame this conversation more about what are the needs, how can we plan for this in the future, and why this is a very important asset with some cost, with some hurdles, with some issue to deal with, but a very big potential on which we need to talk about real numbers and real opportunity to change the policies, to reform our legal policy, immigration policy system. If we can direct the conversation in that direction, would be really, really useful.
Yeah, I'll just echo that point that having a real adult conversation where we talk about, both that immigration can be really great, but, talk about where there might be challenges, where there might be some growing pains and how the government might address that would be really helpful. And I think, ideally creating systems that allow the people who want to come and work in this country to come do that relatively easily so that nobody is just feeling like they have to show up at the border. That instead, they can go to the US Embassy and apply. And even if they don't know employers here, get connected with employers in the US who might be interested in hiring them and find a way where we make this feasible and relatively easy for everybody involved. I think just will take away any sort of feeling of chaos if it becomes relatively easy to do this legally. And right now, that is not at all the case.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode of Data Nation from the MIT Institute for Data Systems and Society. You can learn more about IDSS and listen to previous episodes at our website, idss.mit.edu, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our producers, Tina Toby Mack, and assistant producers, Ben Stoll and Maria Brooks. Don't forget to leave us a review and follow our Twitter at MIT IDSS to stay informed. Thank you again for listening to MIT's Data Nation.